The United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. Maduro was a fugitive from justice. This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela.
CBS News 24/7 continuing coverage. You know, today's arraignment and not guilty pleas from Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores come after about 48 hours since U.S. Delta forces captured them in that pre-dawn raid Saturday. Shortly after, Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, you see her right there, sworn in as acting leader. Well, President Trump, for his part, warned the interim president would pay a price if she does not cooperate with the United States. Listen.
We're dealing with the people. We're dealing with the people that just got sworn in. And don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
Have you spoken with her?
We're in charge.
Have you spoken with her?
No, I haven't, but other people have.
Do you want to?
All right, so live at the White House and CBS News senior White House and politics reporter Ed O'Keefe. Ed, the president says we're in charge. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, though, says that the long-term plan wasn't for the U.S. to have any sort of hand in the government there. How do those messages square today?
And adding to that, Reed, a little while ago at the UN in New York, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, told the Security Council in part, quote, "There is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who's now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. So Waltz comes out of the Rubio camp, which is this is not a full-blown occupation. We were conducting a limited law enforcement operation, and we'll work with the new Venezuelan leadership to ensure that things go our way. That is different than we're in charge, which is what the president was saying last night on his way back here from Florida. And it's all going to be subject to intense questioning from senior lawmakers when they meet with these senior administration officials, including the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, later today up on Capitol Hill. The leaders of the House and the Senate, the heads of the Intelligence, Armed Services, and Foreign Relations committees in both of those chambers, also set to be part of what's called a classified briefing, but we'll see to what extent we might learn some information shared by Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, the Attorney General Pam Bondi, the CIA Director John Ratcliffe, as we try to get a handle on what exactly is next in terms of U.S. engagement with Venezuela. Obviously, the U.S. Publicly is supportive of Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, who by the Venezuelan government now has been put in charge. But the sort of vague statements on we want control of petroleum, we want to ensure that all these other interests like Hamas or Iran or Russia and China are kicked out of the country. How do you enforce that? How do you oversee that? Who is responsible for that? None of that yet answered by the White House. The president is here working this afternoon. We know he was monitoring the arraignment of Maduro, not necessarily watching coverage because, of course, there was no live coverage of a federal court proceeding. But he is aware of it. He is scheduled to have a meeting in the 3 o'clock Eastern hour with some of his top aides that is the kind of meeting that could suddenly open up to reporters, so we'll see if that happens. And if it does, of course, we'll bring that to you live and see if he provides any more clarity what exactly is planned next.
Well, as if Venezuela wasn't lead story enough, or what's going on there in the Big Apple relative to Ms. Maduro in court today, there's also recent statements by the president about other nations since carrying out this operation in Venezuela. Talk through what the president's statements have been relative to other territories.
Well, all in the Western Hemisphere. He's talking now about what he calls the Monroe Doctrine, which is his interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, which, of course, was used to justify U.S. engagement across the Western Hemisphere for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. In this case, he talked or was asked on his flight home from Florida last night specifically about engagement in Colombia, Cuba, Iran, Mexico, and Greenland. On Colombia, he says that country, quote, is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the U.S. The Colombian leader, quote, is not going to be doing it for very long. Important to point out, President Petro is term limited, and there are elections in Colombia later this year, so there could be new leadership anyway at some point, whether or not the U.S. engages forcefully before then. On Cuba, he says it looks like it's, quote, ready to fail, and that Cuban Americans will be very happy about it. Iran, he says he's watching the situation there very closely. Remember, there have been some protests in recent days and growing intrigue about whether or not this might mean something for the current Iranian regime. The president says that if the Iranians start killing those protesters, they will, quote, be hit very hard by the United States. And when asked about Mexico, if you're concerned about drug trafficking, why not target Mexico? The president said he's repeatedly offered that country's President Claudia Sheinbaum to have U.S. troops go in and help deal with cartels, but that she's been unwilling. Quote, Mexico has to get their act together because they're pouring through Mexico and we're going to have to do something. We'd love Mexico to do it. They're capable of doing it. And then he was asked about Greenland. Remember, even before he took office last year, he was talking about the possibility of a U.S. takeover, or at least far larger presence inside Greenland, which is controlled by Denmark. He said, yeah, we're going to need to work on that as well. Important to point out, amid the calls the Secretary of State is making today to foreign counterparts was the foreign minister of the Netherlands, not Denmark, but the Netherlands. And that's a critical kind of temperature taking for the Secretary of State, because there's going to be grave concern now that if he starts talking again about some kind of takeover of Greenland, what that could mean for the relationship with Europe and with NATO, because Denmark is also a NATO member. So if you have two NATO countries potentially in conflict here, what would the rest of the alliance do? So we'll wait and see. But again, he's not backing off any of this, and yet he has senior national security foreign affairs officials out there suggesting things different than him. Whether that's part of the strategy to keep these adversaries on their toes as the president says things and then other officials wink, nod, and tell everyone it's going to be different, or whether there is indeed some disconnect, is hard to gauge at this point, as many things can be with this administration, because ultimately it settles with the president, and his statement, of course, supersedes anybody else's. But unless or until we see signs of direct U.S. engagement, either diplomatically, commercially, or militarily, it's hard to know what exactly the next steps could be, and we suspect we'll know more later today about whether they were asked and answered that by lawmakers.
And you are in the place to get the answers. Ed O'Keefe, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.